The wind howled across the barren landscape, a merciless thing carrying sand that cut like tiny blades. This was Nevada, 1878, a graveyard of broken dreams where the sun beat down like a hammer on the cracked earth. In the middle of all that desolation stood a lonely homestead, its wood bleached to the color of bone. On the porch stood Margaret Sullivan. At 35, she was a woman carved from grief and survival. The desert had stolen the youth from her face, but it couldn't touch the quiet beauty in her high cheekbones or the strength in her sage-colored eyes. For 3 years, she had been alone. 3 years since the fever took her husband James, leaving her with nothing but silence and the whispers of the town. Poor Margaret, they'd say, childless, alone on land that didn't want her. Their pity was a poison she had to swallow with every bag of flour she bought. She tried to hire help. Old Pete, who quit after 2 weeks. The Sawyer boy who fled after 3 days, claiming the silence was driving him mad. Each failure cost her precious money and chipped another piece from her spirit. But desperation guides a person's hand. Yesterday, she'd seen a notice tacked to the saloon board. Experienced hand-seeking work. No questions asked. Fair wage expected. It was simple. Honest. When she'd asked the saloon keeper, he'd nodded toward a young man sitting alone in the corner. "That's him," he'd muttered. "Rode in 2 days ago. Keeps to himself. But be careful, Margaret. You don't know a thing about him." She'd approached him anyway. He looked up, and his eyes were a startling blue against his sun-darkened skin. "I need help on my homestead," she said, her voice plain. "Hard work. Fair pay. $50 for the season, plus board." $50. It was nearly everything she had left, a fortune she couldn't afford to part with. The young man had barely reacted, just a slight raise of his eyebrows before he nodded. "When do I start, ma'am? Name's William Thornton. Folks call me Will." And now she was waiting for a stranger who could be her salvation or her final ruin. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, a lone rider. As he drew closer, she saw the worn leather chaps, the hat pulled low. He rode with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more nights under the stars than under a roof. He was younger than she'd thought, maybe 25, but he moved like someone who had already seen too much of the world. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Mr. Thornton," she replied, her heart thumping in her chest. She watched him lead his horse to the barn, noting the gentle way he spoke to the animal, the calm in his strong hands. When he returned, she crossed her arms, a shield against the world. "I'll tell you plain," she said. "This isn't easy work. The land fights you every step. There's little comfort here." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Comfort and I parted ways long ago. I'm just looking for honest work." Something in his voice, steady and respectful, made her pause. She searched his face for lies and found none. "There's a room off the barn," she told him. "Rough but dry. Meals are at sunrise and sunset. Work begins at first light." "Yes, ma'am." The first days passed in a blur of sweat and dust. Will worked with a tireless intensity that shamed the memory of the men who'd come before. He dug fence posts under the punishing sun, repaired the chicken coop, and cleared clogged ditches without a single complaint. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as his muscles strained against the stubborn earth. He was different from the men in town, quieter, more respectful. He was a mystery, and she found herself drawn to it. By the 8th day, the homestead was already transformed. The fence stood straight and strong, the coop was secured, and the barn doors no longer sagged. She stood on the porch that evening, watching him wash at the pump, and felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. "You've done good work," she told him as he approached for supper. "Still plenty more to do," he answered, pausing at the bottom step. "Yes," she admitted softly, "but it's a fine start." That night, the desert wind rose with a violent howl. Dust battered the windows like buckshot, rattling the shutters. Margaret bolted upright in bed as the storm threatened to tear the house apart. She heard a crash outside and hurried to the porch, only to be met by a wall of wind and sand. A strong hand gripped her arm. "Mrs. Sullivan!" Will's voice was nearly swallowed by the storm. He guided her back inside, slamming the door shut as the house groaned. "The chickens," she gasped. "Already secured them in the barn," he said, wiping grit from his face. "Saw the storm coming." They stood in the dim kitchen, dust clinging to their clothes. The lamp flickered, casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the walls. Margaret crossed her arms over her nightgown, suddenly aware of how close they stood, how strange it felt to share her home with this man. "The barn roof won't hold in this," she said. "Then I'll stay here by the stove, if that's acceptable." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "I'll bring blankets." That night, Margaret lay awake in her room, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing from the kitchen floor. The sound filled the silence that had haunted her for 3 years, and for the first time since James's death, she felt something stir within her, not fear, not pity, but the dangerous, undeniable spark of hope. The morning after the storm, the desert lay quiet and clean. Will was already outside, mending shingles the wind had torn from the roof. Inside, Margaret brewed coffee. When Will came in, dusty and tired, he paused at the doorway. "You didn't have to start so early," she said, sliding a cup toward him. "Storm made work for us," he replied. "Best to meet it head on." The way he said "us" struck her. For 3 years it had always been me. She turned away quickly, busying herself at the skillet so he wouldn't see the sudden mist in her eyes. Days turned into weeks. Will worked the land with a tireless dedication, his calloused hands turning broken things whole again. He had a gift with animals, coaxing more eggs from the chickens and somehow convincing her ornery old mule, Moses, to actually work. Margaret found herself speaking more at meals, sharing pieces of her past. He never pressed, never judged. He just listened. One evening as the sun dipped low, Margaret sat on the porch mending. "This land takes more than it gives," she said softly. "It took my husband. The fever came, and he didn't have the strength left to fight." Will was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned on the porch rail. "It's a hard land, but honest. It never pretends to be what it's not." "Is that why you're here?" she asked. "For the honesty?" His lips curved in a faint smile. "Something like that." She realized how little she knew about him. He had appeared in her life out of nowhere, offering strength when hers was almost gone. She hadn't asked about his past, maybe because she was afraid of the answers. The days grew hotter, and the well began to fail. Each bucket brought up more silt than water. Her garden wilted. One afternoon, as she struggled with the rope, Will appeared beside her. "This well won't last," he said, "but I think I found a spring north of here. Could be water under the hills." She shook her head bitterly. "James searched for years. All he found was dust." "Mining teaches a man to read the ground," Will said. "Water moves like veins. Sometimes it hides, waiting for someone who knows where to look." There was a quiet certainty in his voice. She stared at him for a long moment, then handed him the mule's reins. "Go then. If there's hope left in this land, bring it back." He returned near sundown, his face streaked with sweat, but his eyes were alive. "It's there," he said simply. "Not much, but enough. We can dig it out." For 3 days they worked side by side under the merciless sun. Will dug while Margaret hauled away stones and sand. They shared the same tin cup of water, drank from the same hope. On the third day, the miracle happened. Water, cold and clear, seeping into the hole. Margaret dropped to her knees, scooping it into her hands, tears streaming down her face as she tasted it. Sweet, pure life. Without thinking, she threw her arms around him. For a heartbeat, he stiffened. Then slowly, his arms came around her, strong and sure. The embrace was brief, but when they pulled apart, something unspoken lingered between them. But the desert wasn't done testing them. On her next trip to town, the whispers were sharper. $50 for a cowboy, one woman murmured at the store. And more besides, if you ask me. Outside, Samuel Henford, a wealthy, drunken rancher, staggered into her path. "Widow Sullivan," he drawled. "Heard you've got yourself a young hired man. Must get lonely out there." His eyes roamed over her in a way that made her skin crawl. "Maybe I ought to visit, see if he's treating you proper." Before she could speak, a voice cut through the tension. "Mrs. Sullivan, everything all right?" Will stood by her wagon, his posture casual, but his eyes were cold as steel. Henford's smirk faltered. Well, well, the famous hired hand. Will stepped forward, calm but unyielding. My place is wherever Mrs. Sullivan needs me to be. Right now, that's helping her load supplies. For a long moment, it seemed violence might erupt. Then Henford laughed harshly. Careful, boy, you're playing a dangerous game. He staggered off, but the threat lingered. That evening, the air in the small house was heavy. He bothers you again. You tell me, Will said simply. I can handle Samuel Henford, she replied, though her hands trembled. I know you can, Will said, his eyes meeting hers. Doesn't mean you should have to. Her heart twisted. For years she had borne everything alone, and now this stranger was offering to stand with her. She didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified of what it meant. By midday, the dust of riders appeared on the horizon. Margaret's stomach tightened. Sheriff Coleman rode at the front, flanked by Henford and two others. The sheriff looked weary, as if he'd rather be anywhere else. Morning, Mrs. Sullivan, he said, tipping his hat. Mr. Thornton. Will wiped his hands on his trousers, standing tall. Sheriff, we've had complaints, Coleman said reluctantly, about disturbances in town, about appearances out here. His eyes flicked toward Margaret. It'd be best if you parted ways. Complaints? Margaret's voice shook with outrage. You mean gossip? Henford smirked. Folks are concerned is all. A widow paying a drifter $50. It doesn't look right. It doesn't matter how it looks, Margaret snapped. He's done nothing but honest work. Henford's gaze turned cold. Maybe so, but a woman living alone with a young man, it corrupts decent society. Will stepped forward. If this is about me, I'll go. No, Margaret said fiercely. You won't. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. I'm sorry, Margaret. If he stays past tomorrow, I'll have to take him in. Assault, disturbing the peace. A judge won't look kindly on it. The riders left, their dust hanging in the air. Margaret stood frozen. You should have let them take me, Will said quietly. No, she spun to face him. They had no right. Rights don't matter when men like Henford twist the law. His jaw tightened. I'll pack my things. Her heart pounded. She couldn't lose him. Not now. You can't leave, she whispered. Not when... She stopped herself, but the words burned in her throat. Not when I love you. That night she found him sitting outside the barn, his saddlebags packed. Where will you go? She asked. Doesn't matter, he said. Somewhere my past can't follow. Your past? He hesitated, then his story spilled out. His real name wasn't Will Thornton. It was Daniel Morrison. He'd left Texas 5 years ago, a fugitive. His father had been a hard, abusive man. One night, he'd raised a belt to Daniel's sister. Daniel had stopped him for good. But his father's brother was the sheriff. It didn't matter that it was self-defense. They would have hanged him, so he ran. The truth should have frightened her, but it didn't. She saw the boy he had been, the man who had stood between her and Henford without hesitation. We're all running from something, she said softly, but maybe we don't have to run alone. Before he could answer, the sound of hooves broke the night. Lanterns flared. Henford rode in with his men, whiskey on his breath and hate in his eyes. Evening, Mrs. Sullivan, he called mockingly. Thought we'd see how you and your cowboy are getting along. Leave, Margaret said, standing tall on the porch. Now where's the fun in that? Henford sneered, stepping forward. Will moved faster, planting himself between them. You heard her. Time to go. Or what? Henford's smile twisted. The first punch came quick. Will's fist cracked against a ranch hand's jaw. Chaos erupted. Margaret ran inside, grabbed her rifle, and returned. Stop, she yelled, her voice steady. Get off my land. Henford turned, his eyes full of mockery. Look at that. The widow thinks she's a gunslinger now. He laughed, an ugly, mean sound. This isn't over. They rode off into the darkness, leaving blood and threats in the dust. Will wiped his lip, his chest heaving. I shouldn't have thrown that punch. They would have come anyway, Margaret whispered, lowering the rifle. He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. You're the bravest woman I know. The space between them vanished. His hand brushed hers, warm and calloused. She leaned forward, her heart in her throat. Then he stepped back, torn. I should check on the animals, he said hoarsely, disappearing into the barn. Margaret stood frozen, the taste of what might have been heavy on her lips. In the distance, a coyote howled, and she knew whatever piece they had built was about to be torn apart. Dawn came pale and unforgiving. Margaret hadn't slept. Will's horse was still in the barn. He hadn't run. They ate in silence, the sunset deadline hanging over them like a noose. At midday, a lone rider appeared. It was Mrs. Garrett, the school teacher. "Margaret, I've come to warn you," she said, her voice urgent. "There's ugly talk in town. Henford's been buying drinks, stirring people up. They're talking about running him out on a rail. Or worse." She glanced at Will. "And you. They're saying you should be examined by the church elders, declared unfit to manage your own affairs." The threat was clear. They wouldn't just take Will. They would take everything from her. Her land, her freedom, her sanity. "Mr. Thornton," Mrs. Garrett pleaded, "if you care for her at all, leave now. It's the only way to protect her." "And let them win?" Margaret's voice rose. "It's not about winning," the teacher said gently. "It's about surviving." After she left, Will turned to Margaret. "She's right. I should go." "No," Margaret laughed bitterly. "Don't you understand? Whether you stay or go, they've already decided I'm guilty. At least if you stay, we face it together. And when they lock me up? When they declare you insane?" His control finally cracked. "Is that better?" "Yes!" The word tore from her throat. "At least we'd have fought." "Listen to me," he said, grabbing her shoulders. "I've spent 5 years running because I know what happens when you fight a battle you can't win. I can't let them do that to you." "I don't care about the life I deserve," she cried. "I care about—" Her words were cut off by the sound of approaching horses. Many horses. They'd come early. Sheriff Coleman led the group, but behind him rode at least 15 men. It wasn't a posse. It was a mob. "Mr. Thornton," the sheriff called, "I'm going to need you to come with me." "The sun hasn't set yet," Margaret said. "Plans changed," Henford drawled. "The good people of this town decided they didn't want to wait." Henford's smile was cold. "That's not what I saw last night. A pretty passionate embrace for a proper widow and her hired hand." The crowd murmured. They'd been watching, waiting. "I kissed him," Margaret said, her voice ringing out clear and defiant. "After you threatened us, I kissed the man who defended me. And I'm not ashamed of it." The silence was deafening. Then someone muttered, "Shameless," and the murmur grew to a roar. "Take me," Will said suddenly, stepping forward. "Leave Mrs. Sullivan out of it. I'll confess to whatever you want. Just leave her alone." "No," Margaret cried, but he gently freed himself. "Trust me," he murmured. He walked toward the sheriff, hands empty and visible. But as he passed Henford's horse, the rancher spurred forward, striking Will with his rifle butt. Will dropped to his knees, blood streaming from his temple. Margaret screamed. A ranch hand shoved her back, and she fell hard, her head striking the edge of the porch. Through the ringing in her ears, she saw Will roar with rage, surging to his feet and pulling the man from his horse. Chaos erupted, dust, blood, and shouting. Then a single gunshot. Will staggered, clutching his side. A red flower bloomed across his shirt. "No!" Margaret crawled toward him as he collapsed. She gathered him into her lap, his blood warm on her hands. "Stay with me," she begged. "Please." His hand found hers, his grip weak. Should have. Left. "Don't you dare," she sobbed. "Don't you dare leave me now." His blue eyes found hers, even as they began to dim. "Love you," he whispered. "Worth it. To love you." Then his eyes closed, and Margaret Sullivan screamed her grief to the uncaring desert sky. The doctor worked through the night. Somehow, against all odds, Daniel lived. For 3 days he hovered between life and death. Margaret never left his side. On the 4th day his eyes opened, clear and focused. "Margaret," he whispered. "I'm here." She gripped his hand, tears streaming down her face. "I'm right here." The violence had shocked the town. The sight of blood on Margaret's hands as she held him had awakened them from their mob fever. The sheriff came by, hat in hand, to mumble that no charges would be filed. But the damage was done. They were outcasts. "We can't stay here," Will said one evening, stronger now. I know, she looked out at the land she'd fought so hard for. It didn't seem to matter anymore. This place was never my home. It was my prison. What do you want to do now? He asked. I want to go somewhere green, she said. Somewhere with trees and water that doesn't have to be coaxed from the ground. Somewhere we can be whoever we choose to be. We, unless you've changed your mind. Never, his grip tightened. But Margaret, I'm still wanted in Texas. Then we don't go to Texas, she smiled. Daniel Morrison is dead, remember? Time for both of us to become someone new. 3 weeks later, she stood in the bank president's office, selling her land to Henford for a fraction of its worth. It was enough to start over. My husband and I are relocating to Oregon, she said calmly, signing the last document. The climate here doesn't agree with his health. The lie came easily. They'd been married by a traveling preacher 2 days before, with only Mrs. Garrett as a witness. As they rode out of town, Henford himself stepped out of the general store. He simply watched them go, his face unreadable, then spat in the dust and turned away. The journey to Oregon took 6 weeks. They called themselves David and Mary Carter, newlyweds seeking a fresh start. No one questioned their story. They found a small homestead for sale outside Salem, 40 acres with a house, a barn, and a creek. It was everything the desert was not. Green, lush, alive. Mary began working at the local clinic, her nursing skills impressing the town doctor. Will found work training horses, his gentle patience a gift with troubled animals. They built a new life, a new community, a new home. In their second spring, Mary stood in her garden when she felt a strange flutter in her belly. After years of being told she was barren, she was carrying a child, Will's child. When she told him, he lifted her off her feet, his voice breaking. Happy? Mary, I never thought I'd have this. A real family. A home. Their daughter was born on a crisp October morning. Sarah, Will whispered, cradling the tiny bundle. Her name is Sarah Margaret Carter. Sarah for the sister he'd lost. Margaret for the woman she'd been. Years passed. The pain of her past faded to a distant scar. On Sarah's third birthday, their old friend Mrs. Garrett visited from Nevada. What news from town? Mary asked. The town's nearly dead, Mrs. Garrett said. The drought got worse after you left. Without your spring, Henford's ranch failed. Most folks moved on. Mary felt no satisfaction, only a distant sadness. She had sabotaged the spring before they left, filling it back in with rocks and dirt, unwilling to leave such a gift to a man like Henford. That night, she and Will sat on their porch. The stars were bright. An owl called from the forest. Do you ever miss it? He asked. The desert? Only the sunsets, she said. But no, I don't miss the life I had there. She leaned her head on his shoulder. Thank you, he said simply, for taking a chance on a drifter, for seeing more in me than I saw in myself. Thank you, she replied, for reminding me I was worth fighting for. They went inside together, to their home, their daughter, their life. The desert would keep its secrets, and the past would hold its ghosts. But Mary and David Carter had found their happy ending in a green valley, far from where they'd started. And in the end, that was the only truth that mattered. Thank you so much for listening. What do you think would have happened if Will hadn't survived the shooting? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story of second chances and unexpected love, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the heart of the frontier. Thanks for watching.